making sure they're secure, and then designing flexible or resilient APIs is something that requires a lot of cognitive load. I think that the more accessible your data is, the more attractive you're going to look for large language models, right? I started blogging and I made YouTube videos because with me thinking through how can I explain something I built, how can I explain the issue that I'm facing and asking for help is so underrated.
Hello and welcome to another edition of Coffee with Developers. We're here live in Croatia. It's boiling, everybody's got shorts on, we don't. It's really not fair. But I'm here with Joycelyn from Postman.
Hi.
So, how do you feel?
I'm also warm and I didn't realize I was supposed to have coffee.
Okay. So, Postman Pat was the most successful show for such a long time on BBC television. And then Peppa Pig came around and Paw Patrol. How do you feel about that?
I think that it battles with us for SEO, but now if you Google Postman, when I first started working at Postman, that's how I know what Postman Pat is. But now Postman wins.
Okay, cool. So what do you do?
I work in developer relations at Postman, so I'm based in San Francisco. I'm just out here I'm giving a talk on reverse engineering at this conference. Sometimes I write blog posts, sometimes I build things, sometimes I make videos.
Reverse engineering?
Yeah.
As in trying to understand how systems work without getting access to them?
Yes, so reverse engineering a private API and coming at it from an API consumer standpoint and also producers. Sometimes producers need to reverse engineer their own APIs.
Okay, and yeah, of course when you got an old system handed over to you without any documentation, you also have to see how does this really work.
Exactly. Have you ever had to reverse engineer an API?
Oh yeah. I worked at lots of Yahoo and Mozilla and worked with a lot of enterprise customers that basically had a black box machine there and they're like, okay, this thing works. We tried to clone the machine, it didn't work, and then we basically had to do something. I learned programming by giving myself endless lives in computer games because I was bad at playing. So I realized if there's a life going away on the screen and I actually see what did that, I can actually give myself endless lives.
Yeah.
And then I started analyzing the assembly code of the games and then I started writing my own. So that's how old I am.
Well, it's interesting. A lot of developers get their start because of video gaming and just wanting to succeed and, cheat.
There's a lot of educational materials out there as well, like Code Combat, where you have a little game and you have to write JavaScript to make your character move through a maze and stuff. And I think it's a very interesting thing to get people into programming.
Yeah, just to gamify it a bit.
Yeah.
Yeah, Twilio Quest.
Yes.
Yeah, it's kind of very interactive, engaging, you're in the game, but it kind of takes you out and then has you do little educational exercises.
And it's been around at many events I've been at the last 4 years, but it vanished lately. It's interesting how, I guess we all got our cuts, so that might be the issue there. So how do you see Postman for a developer that is starting right now, helping them to understand the world of APIs better?
Well, I've been at Postman almost 7 years now, and when I first started, it was 1 or 2 boot camps and colleges that were starting to introduce Postman into the curriculum, but now, everyone's just using Postman to experience APIs for beginners, right? So experienced devs use Postman, but just experiencing, tweaking, understanding that feedback immediately, I think it helps people understand what an API is.
I guess mocking as well is a very important thing, and simulating responses without deleting the database is a good thing.
Oh yeah, there's definitely advanced stuff you can do with Postman, and whoever's going to go to my talk tomorrow is going to be sorely disappointed, but come talk to me afterwards if you want to learn some advanced stuff.
So how does that fit in? You go in here as a Postman employee and you talk about a thing you don't do?
About reverse engineering?
Yeah.
I have reverse engineered something before, but I would hazard that most developers haven't had to, unless you're a QA, unless you're security, unless you have a job function that requires you to hack away at something or kind of find the edge cases. Most developers don't have a need to reverse engineer.
It's bizarre. The more you dive into the security world, the more you actually don't want to touch light switches in hotel rooms and stuff. Like, it's unbelievable what kind of software allows you to put all kind of information in and just basically renders it out again, and that's the biggest mistake you can make. But the basic mistakes are still being done. Do you think there's an education problem there, that developers don't learn about how to write safe code first, but learn how to write a lot of code first?
I think that's a very developer thing, where you write the happy path. You create the user stories that are just pure happy path. And until you have to be the one that fixes something in production, until you're the one on call, I don't think you are incentivized. Unless you're the one that gets called. Yeah.
I think it's also, the systems nowadays are rather forgiving. Like, when I started, like, any mistake was basically like, okay, that's 4 hours offline that you have to talk to your boss about what's going to happen here. We have a lot of fail safes in place nowadays already.
Yeah, or stuff just is brittle in production. It's the same issue with API design, I find. Testing APIs, making sure they're secure, and then designing flexible or resilient APIs is something that requires a lot of cognitive load early on. And if you don't need to think about every scenario early on, a lot of devs won't do it.
Yeah. In 2007, I wrote a book on, like, making web development with open APIs. Like Yahoo APIs, Google APIs, like authentication APIs. It was like Craigslist. All of them are dead now, so my book is pretty useless. Do you think there was a grace period where we had lots of APIs for us to play with, but they kind of vanished because of abuse, or what was the reason?
I don't see that downtrend. I think if you're talking about like the Reddit API and the Twitter API going through some drastic pricing changes and essentially becoming almost partner APIs instead of public open APIs, there's a couple examples of that, but I think that the more accessible your data is, the more attractive you're going to look for like large language models, right? So I think there's going to be another swing the opposite way.
Okay, because back in the days it was just open REST APIs. You had an endpoint and you got the data back, and you could put parameters in there to get the data. And nowadays it's always like sign up, get a key, go through like an OAuth dance, and then actually you can access our data. Is this something you see more?
I see what you're saying. Yes. So sorry, there's a lot of people walking by. Every company is going to want to track stuff to optimize the user experience for you. And of course, they want to own the data. There's a benefit in that, but to optimize the actual experience and also to be able to like regulate it properly.
Yeah, I worked my last job before I had this. I was the technical product manager on the Edge dev tools. So I worked on the network tool, and we did the network console. And then everybody's like, "That's going to make Postman unnecessary, so you can't release that." We didn't release it. It didn't make you unnecessary, but it was interesting to see that people, if you build it into a product, then why we use a third-party service? But I think the benefit of something like Postman is that you can also script it from the command line, and actually, rather than doing that with Chromium, with Selenium or with other things in the browser, that's an easy way of doing it.
I'll have to take a look at that functionality, but my talk tomorrow is going to be hand in hand with DevTools and Postman.
Yeah, it basically is like the network tool, but you were able to intercept the call and change the parameters and get them back. And you can even set up a group of calls that you can actually export in Postman format. So we used that internally to test our own browser and our own APIs. So we needed that one, and then we just thought we'd give it out to the world as well.
And I love it when DevTools think about that extensibility, right? Just letting you do some functionality that you know they're already taking it and putting it in Postman. So if you build that functionality in your own tool, Postman just released the VS Code extension. And people are like, why would you want to move stuff out of the Postman platform? And it's because we watch developers do their work, right? You can watch live streams and see how they do it. And you're still on Postman, the platform, but not in the app, right? So you're in VS Code and you don't want to be switching windows. I think that's very clever.
Yeah, the HTTP client extension for VS Code had millions of users, and that was just allowing you to write like raw HTTP into the editor and get it executed into the console.
Yeah, and that's a very basic putting API call in a dev tool and firing it off, I think it's a very basic developer workflow. Every developer does that, but I have talked to developers that don't do that and will just write. And in fact, I think one developer I've talked to here writes JavaScript to fire something off.
Okay, I mean the Fetch API gives you full access to the HTTP headers nowadays, so I use curl for that, but I'm old.
You gotta love curl. I still use curl.
We actually have a video, one of those as well, Coffee with Developers, with the inventor of curl, who's a friend of mine from Sweden, and he's like, this dude, I just do it from home, I just like doing it, and it's like that XKCD joke where it's like 90% of the web is dependent on something that somebody wrote in 1983 and never documented. Feels like it to a degree.
And I love curl for very simple use cases. I talked to another developer that had their API, their internal API, had something like 200 headers.
Wow.
Right? So if you're writing that in curl, that's a beast.
It's nuts what's actually coming on the initial request. What people don't realize, how you can slow down your website with a bad fav icon that is far too big because it goes on every HTTP request that goes to your site. It's just, I found a 12 megabyte fav icon once and people wondered why their traffic was through the roof.
Yeah.
But that's, again, where something like your product would help you actually stress test it and try to find out where the data comes from, where it goes.
There's been some new releases, less related to the analytics that I'm guessing you're talking about in DevTools. You're talking about page load times?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And also memory consumption, because it stays in there forever.
Yeah.
That's the other problem. So it's an interesting space. When I talk to engineers that I hired for us, and we were working on the network stack, I think there is not enough information out there about how just the requests work. We concentrate on how rendering in the browser works and in 3D engines, but just how to get something on the screen. People are just like, that's just black magic and it hopefully works.
Have you seen the new Vercel Zero, V0 release? I don't know if you're going to be talking that in a later session, but that's pretty mind-blowing.
Yeah, it is pretty mind-blowing. At the same time, it caused a big stir with the inaccessibility of it. And that was really, there was it's basically really hard for somebody who can't see to use it. And of course, that's okay to not have thought of that in an alpha, but it was a big hoo-ha because people then got very aggressive against accessibility pro people, and it was just horrible. You can't release anything without causing a stir on social media, I guess.
Yeah, and Postman's gotten its share of flack for accessibility too, because it's a graphical user interface, and so a lot of the functionality is not the friendliest for somebody that's not going to be navigating a GUI.
I mean, the other problem is, of course, that a lot of these releases are super US-centric, and it's sometimes really hard to even get access in Europe by now. Like a lot of stuff like Threads, for example, the app is still not released in Europe because they have to be GDPR compliant and they don't want to be.
I thought GDPR was for anybody that had customers in Europe.
Basically any data that you get from people, you have to tell people that you're taking that data. That's why we have cookie consent banners all over the place. I always thought that cookie consent banners should be biscuit consent in the UK, but people don't localize that.
Yeah, I read something recently about that cookie consent saying it was intended to actually empower consumers, but the way they rolled it out just doesn't even.
People didn't understand it. They just said I get them all, I don't care. It's they thought they educate people about what data goes in and out, but people just saw it as a nuisance. I think most browsers will actually click them automatically for you soon, which is kind of weird because
it defeats the intent.
Yeah. So, how did you get into the place where you are right now? Because, I mean, I lived in San Francisco in 2000 as well, worked for eToys back then, and it was just, and then out of a sudden 2003, 2006, the whole social media thing started, and it changed completely. How do you get into the DevRel work? And as far as I understood, you're actually going back to an IC role now?
Indeed, yeah. So I came from the business side of tech. I was a product manager, I did product marketing, I did pricing, a bunch of that stuff. And speaking of throwbacks, you can guess how old I am, but I was a product manager during the mobile evolution, right? So you were talking about social, mobile, local, solo mode. Do you remember that acronym? So I came from the business side, PMM, and I went to a coding boot camp when I moved to San Francisco, and I thought I might become an engineer I thought I might go back into product. Just knowing how to code at the very basic level is very helpful, no matter if you're going to be a coder or not. And then I just fell into developer relations. I didn't even know it was a thing. And you have to work at a company that sells to developers to have a function for developer relations. And so my background of communicating and analyzing and then getting the word out there is really very a quick jump. So I've been at Postman almost 7 years in developer relations as a developer advocate. Was head of developer relations and community, and recently I went back to an IC role because anyone who has led a team lead or a manager, I think a lot of people that do that find it fulfilling, but then miss the IC work, actually getting stuff done and creating.
It's a very American HR term, IC. It's actually, I worked with Microsoft, I was an IC6 and I couldn't even get a match in Europe, so you don't do that. So it basically means you're not in a management role, you're in a technical role, contributing again. But it's, whenever I talk to people, I'm an IC5 and then I'll start a train.
What do they do in Europe then if they're not?
The job title is not that related to your level. It's a different kind of, and we have a lot fewer levels as well.
Yeah.
Especially, a lot of American corporations take it from the Yahoos and the Googles and the Microsofts and replicate that in a smaller company.
Right. Yeah.
Most companies here grow more organically, and then it's like I just became, in 2 months I became from director to VP of developer relations, because now I have a team, and to be a team that is part of the other team, I need to become a VP. So that's kind of
managers
VP. It's kind of odd, but anyways, it was interesting to see how these changes are. You just said you are 7 years now there. I was 8 years at Microsoft. And what really fascinated me about this is the average tenure that I had with developers working for me was 1 to 2 years. So it's really frustrating because by the time you teach them, they leave.
Yeah, in the Bay Area, I think software engineers are somewhere around 9 months tenure.
It costs you about $20,000 to get an engineer through the door.
And how much time, right?
Yeah.
And so what that tells me is if you can lengthen that tenure by a few months, you're already doing well. But what is it about moving to another company that is beneficial to the engineer?
Yeah, and people think it's the money, and I don't think it is. When you do developer surveys, it's more like recognition within the company of your contribution. How do you do that with your teams? Well, now that you're an IC, you don't have to anymore, but how did you do it before?
I don't think we've cracked, I don't have secrets to tell you, but we do what a lot of other companies do, where we have a kudos channel, and it's literally about saying, in DevRel, we have a saying, what do you do, why do you do what you do? Why do people contribute to open source projects? It's for love, money, or fame, right? And so that's external communities. But internally, love, money, or fame, right? Appreciation, the kudos across the company, or money. And you're saying it's probably not money.
Well, I wrote a developer advocacy handbook in 2006, and the first thing I said, it's a two-way street. It's not just going out there and selling software to developers or solutions to people on a technical level, but it's also being an advocate for the people in your company to make sure that they have everything that they need to give them the appreciation that they should have, and to drag them on stage with you and give a face to the solution.
Yeah.
And help them become that person that is actually self-assured enough to stand up for that.
Yeah.
It's something I see not as much as I would love it to see.
Well, if you want to get into it, it's kind of like the difference between evangelism and advocacy, which I'm guessing you've written a book about.
Yeah.
Yeah, probably. My TLDR is that advocacy is the emoji, the megaphone emoji.
Yeah.
Or evangelism is rather. Advocacy is the ear emoji.
Okay. Well, no, that was a kind of a weird thing as well. Everyone's like, oh, evangelism is that's like the televangelists in America, and it is a religious thing. It was never in Europe, so I didn't understand what the problem was. But then I realized that advocacy is a better term because you speak for the developer.
Yeah.
That's what you do basically in both directions.
Yeah.
But a lot of companies don't actually see that DevRel should also keep themselves on their toes.
Yeah, well, a lot of times developer relations will report up their product or engineering, and then they're more closely coupled to the product lifecycle, right? Or they're working with marketing or like growth, and then they're more coupled to the go-to-market motion. So it's very indicative. And something like at Postman, we've had reworks as the company's vision has changed.
How do you, what makes you most happy about your job? What makes you stand up every day and say like, okay, that's cool, I want to do this right now. Nobody has to tell me to do it.
Yeah, I've had this conversation before where I've never had a position in sales, but like salespeople, after they get off the call and then they close a deal, they high five, right? The closing of the deal, going in for the kill or whatever, is really like what lights their fire. And for advocacy, I've heard other people say what really like lights them up is being able to help somebody, right? So that's one-to-one, one-to-many.
Yeah.
But it's seeing the knowledge, right? Oh, I just taught them something. I just showed them something new. Like that is the spark.
Oh, it's amazing to make people grow around you and see them grow and do something else, even if they leave. But they then 5 months later, another company calls you, oh, an engineer just started here, and he kept talking about what you did. Can we have some meetings about this here as well? And this is just that like spark that you give people that they bring somewhere else is really, really fun to see.
And there's people that do not work in developer relations function. There are definitely people, and you know on your team who those people are. They're the people that always share tips, that always kind of like, maybe they're pair programming and they show you a little something. They're the senior engineers who are actually patient enough to like talk through and show you some tricks.
That's another thing, like as a senior engineer, how do you get the time to do that? I always was like, you're supposed to actually make your engineers do stuff, but that personal stuff, that's what HR is for. And personally, I always found that HR is there to cover the backside of the company and not actually be there for people.
Well, that's what HR is for, right? They're there to, they're an advocate for the company.
Yeah. Yeah, but not a defender for the company.
They're the legal, sometimes they're the legal defender of the company, right? Yeah.
One of the things that I learned really early on is that teaching something to somebody else is the best way to learn it yourself. Would you agree with that?
That's actually how I got started. So even before I knew what developer relations was, I started blogging and I made like YouTube videos. Because with me thinking through how can I explain something I built, how can I explain the issue that I'm facing and asking for help is so underrated, right? If you're a junior engineer and you can articulate the problem that you're facing, what you did to try to solve it, senior engineers are going to be way more patient with you, A. But B, that communication is incredibly important. AWS famously has like a one-pager culture, right? And if you can boil down an entire meeting into one page and then give it to everyone, you've taken the time to synthesize what the problem is and what you want people's time for.
Yeah, I think creativity within limitations is a big thing. My first stuff that I wrote as a programmer was on like a machine with 64K memory and 1 gigahertz processor, and there was no way to change that. That's basically limits you have to work in. And I always find that there is, as a new developer coming out right now, you've got thousands of frameworks to choose from. You've got zero setup environments. You don't have to fight for the little things to actually get there. Do you think that actually means people are not appreciative enough for what they do as developers, or is it something that you said people are going for the easiest way anyways?
Yeah, I don't know if you have to feel the struggle to really appreciate it. There's so many cool frameworks that just abstract a lot of the complexity. I don't know if junior engineers need to spend a lot of their brain power shopping for the next tech stack. You know, great if you can inherit the tech stack or it's mandated, because that's a constraint. Then you can focus on what you have control over.
But we do have a new framework every month that people get excited about, so that's also distracting, right?
We do, and some people that try those new frameworks out are just early adopters, and others of them are truly looking for, I have a problem with my current framework, and I think this might solve it.
Yeah, so that's where contribution comes in, isn't it? Like, instead of saying, like, I have a problem with the current framework, I'm going to contribute to that one and fix it. Oftentimes people are like, oh, I'm going to write my own instead.
I love it when that happens, and if you're lucky enough to work on tech like Postman's like that, where a lot of the educational content comes comes from the Postman team, but way more comes from the community. People are at hackathons are teaching people how to, use the API client. People are creating whole tutorials and giving talks and demoing their own tech using Postman.
One thing I made sure that everywhere I worked, I released everything is open source, because that means anybody contributing to it will have the name associated with a great product forever. Like it basically shows on GitHub, I worked on this, I can prove it, I haven't put it on my CV and people have to test it. It's really sometimes tough to convince your company to do that. How did you do that, or how was your idea there? So
Postman's open core, so our runtime is completely open source. We have a ton of frameworks.
It's open core.
It's open core, yes. And in fact, recently we released, there's a very popular open source command line runner called Newman that lets you run collections. And recently we released Postman CLI, which is closed source. And I'm like, why the heck would we do that? Why would anybody want to use a closed source tool?
Yeah.
Enterprise is the answer.
Yeah, of course. I mean, they don't trust the thing to be like available outside, and they want to have the SLA, and they want to have the EULA, and they want all the bits and bobs that you have there. It's sometimes tricky when an open source project becomes really successful and has to make these decisions. You lose a lot of the community. What do you do to retain them?
Well, fortunately, Postman has people on staff that contribute to those open source projects. Recently, within the last year or two, Postman acquired a bunch of open source teams to allow them, to incubate them, if you will. Yeah.
So you came in sideways into the tech role, as you said, to a degree. What would be the best advice for you, for people like you, to start it now? Can you accelerate that even more than you did? What would be the advice points for somebody who just wants to start in tech but not from scratch? What can you do?
To move into tech or to move into developer relations?
Both. I think they're the same thing.
They can be the same thing. I think I see where you're going there, but I would say I looked at the speaker list for this conference, and there's a lot of people in developer relations. There's a lot of people that have developer advocate title, but there's a lot of full-time engineers, right? And I think even if you're an engineer full-time and you're not getting paid to write a blog post, you're not getting paid to give a conference talk, that could never hurt you, because it helps you synthesize information, like you said earlier. But it really builds your brand, and don't roll your eyes at building the brand, but I think it's super important for future job potentials, current job growth, and recognition.
How do you filter out applicants? What's the thing that you're looking for in somebody you want to hire?
Me personally, is communication skills. So a little bit of that interview mentality. I'm not going to have you write a one-pager, but I will ask you to explain something. Two different ways. So say my interview question is, tell me what an API is, as if I'm a senior developer, but I worked on hardware, so I have no idea what an API is, like an HTTP API, right? And then tell me I'm your 8-year-old niece at a barbecue. And if you can talk to different types of people very coherently and concisely, I think your meetings are going to go so much, your ability to collaborate is so much greater.
What's a thing in technology that makes you that is really interesting and exciting to you that's not AI?
It's AI related. Is that okay? There's so many cool things, but I understand that constraint. Low code. Low code is something that I think is going to be game changing in terms of the landscape. I don't think we're there yet for low code for non-developers, but the low code tools for developers is very exciting for productivity, for enjoyment of doing work.